She whispered their dreams to him, even when silence was the only response. But the moment she was ready to let go, something happened that no one could have foreseen. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe. It takes just a second for you but means the world to me. Time had stopped. Emily Parker no longer counted the days. At some point, she had tried marking them in a notebook, but soon it lost all meaning. What difference did it make if today was different from yesterday when everything remained the same? He still lay motionless in this hospital bed, and she still sat beside him, holding his cold hand. Lucas was here, but at the same time he wasn't. His face looked frozen, as if carved from marble. His skin, once warm and full of life, had turned pale, almost translucent. His lips were dry, drained of the softness they once carried. His once vibrant hair now looked dull, slightly disheveled. Dark eyelashes cast faint shadows on his sharp cheekbones, and his breath, steady and artificially controlled by machines, was the only sign of life. Once his hands had been strong. They lifted her effortlessly, spinning her in laughter-filled embraces. They traced gentle lines across her skin as he tucked stray locks of hair behind her ear. They held her fingers with a certainty that made her feel safe. Now they were still. Emily traced her fingers over the back of his hand, feeling the coolness seep into her skin. She had once been sure that nothing could break him. From the very first time they met, he had been a whirlwind, fearless, alive, filled with energy that could have powered an entire universe. He laughed, he held her, and he had told her he would never leave her. Now he was silent. The steady beeping of the monitors was the only thing breaking the suffocating stillness in the room. Somewhere outside the sterile space, life went on. Cars honked in traffic, people went to cafes, returned home to their families, fell asleep and woke up with the promise of a new day. But for her there was only this room, these walls, and the quiet rhythm of a machine keeping him alive. She closed her eyes. For months now this had been her world. The nurses whispered in the hallways, thinking she couldn't hear them. She's still here. Every night. She never leaves. Poor girl. She had stopped reacting to their voices long ago. They didn't understand. No one did. At first, the doctors had told her there was hope. Then, as the weeks dragged on, they stopped using the word hope altogether. Now they simply looked at her with quiet resignation, as if waiting for the moment she would finally accept the inevitable. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. Her gaze drifted back to his face, memorizing every feature for what felt like the 1000th time. The curve of his jaw, the shape of his lips, the small crease between his eyebrows that deepened when he was lost in thought. She could no longer remember the last time he had smiled. Was it the morning before the accident, when they had shared coffee and listened to the rain tap gently against the window? Or was it later in the car, when he had been telling her a story, and she had teasingly rolled her eyes at him? If she had known it would be the last time, she would have looked at him differently, memorized him better, traced every feature with her eyes, committed every detail to memory. But time doesn't grant second chances. It only takes. Her fingers gently closed around his. "I'll wait," she whispered, her breath barely audible against the quiet hum of the machines. She didn't expect a response. She had stopped expecting one long ago. But she would still stay, as long as it took. Emily hadn't noticed when night had fallen. Through the half-closed blinds, the glow of streetlights cast pale streaks of light across the hospital walls. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, but inside this room time had frozen. She sat in the same chair, in the same position, with her hand resting lightly over his. The air was heavy with the sterile scent of antiseptic, and the quiet hum of medical monitors filled the silence. She had grown so accustomed to these sounds that they felt like part of her own heartbeat. Lucas lay before her unchanged. His chest rose and fell in slow, steady intervals. His lips were dry, his skin unnaturally pale, and the soft stubble on his jaw was the only sign that time was still moving forward. Emily let her fingertips trace the outline of his knuckles, remembering how warm they used to be. Once, these hands had held her so tightly that she had believed nothing could ever separate them. Once, these hands had pulled her close when she was cold, had wiped away her tears, had tucked strands of hair behind her ear when she wasn't looking. Now they didn't move. Her own fingers curled slightly, gently enclosing his hand in her grasp. If she closed her eyes, she could still remember what it felt like to have him hold her back. It had been raining the day they met. She had ducked into a small bookshop on the corner, seeking shelter from the sudden downpour. The wooden shelves stretched high to the ceiling, filling the space with the scent of old paper and coffee from the shop next door. She had reached for a book on the top shelf, standing on her toes, fingers barely grazing the spine. And just as she was about to grab it, another hand appeared beside hers, brushing against her skin. Startled, she turned. A stranger stood there, tall, casually dressed, with an easy, lopsided smile that looked almost amused. "You were trying to steal my book," he said, tilting his head slightly as he studied her. She frowned, flustered. "Your book? Of course. I was just about to grab it," he said, holding up the novel she had been reaching for. "Looks like fate had other plans." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "I didn't even know you were there." He chuckled, flipping the book open as if considering whether or not to keep it for himself. Then, after a beat, he extended it toward her. "All right," he said. "It's yours. But only if you promise to let me borrow it when you're done." She hesitated for a moment before finally taking the book from his hands. "And if I don't return it?" she asked, narrowing her eyes playfully. "Then I'll have to track you down and demand it back," he said, his grin widening. She laughed. "You wouldn't be able to find me. You sure about that?" He held up his phone. "Let's find out." And just like that, Lucas got her number. And a few weeks later, he got her heart. Emily opened her eyes. She replayed that memory often. The way he had smiled, the way he had looked at her, as if he had already decided that she was going to be part of his life. Back then, he had been so full of life. He had always believed that nothing happened by accident, that every encounter, every moment had meaning. And if that were true, then this moment had to mean something too. He had to be fighting. Emily pressed her palm more firmly against his, tilting her head down so her hair fell over her face. "You're still here," she whispered, the words barely making a sound. She had no proof, no medical report, no scientific explanation, nothing concrete to hold on to. But she felt it. Somewhere beyond this silence, beyond the stillness, he was still holding on. And as long as he did, she would wait. For as long as it took. Sleep came to Emily in fragments, slipping through her grasp like sand between her fingers. She had no memory of when exactly she had drifted off, only the dull ache in her neck and shoulders when she stirred. Her body felt stiff, her arms numb from hours spent curled awkwardly in the chair beside his bed. She had fallen asleep with her head resting against her folded arm, her fingers still loosely wrapped around his. As she slowly sat up, the familiar hum of medical monitors filled her ears. Nothing had changed. The blinds were still half drawn, allowing only a sliver of muted morning light to enter the room. The world outside was beginning to stir. Nurses whispered in the hallway. The distant sound of wheels rolling over the polished floor echoed faintly. But inside this room, time remained frozen. Emily turned her gaze to Lucas. His face remained still, unmarked by any sign of awareness. His once warm complexion was pallid under the fluorescent lights, and the light stubble on his jaw made the passage of time painfully obvious. His lips, dry and slightly chapped, had not spoken a single word in months. She swallowed, her throat tight as she slowly traced her thumb along his knuckles. Once, his hands had held her firmly, as if he feared letting go would mean losing her forever. Now they were limp beneath her touch. Her fingers curled slightly, tightening around his. She wanted him to hold her back, but he didn't. It had been the first time they had truly argued. They had been driving out of the city, heading toward a small lake house where they had planned to spend the weekend. The sun had long since disappeared behind the trees, and the car's headlights carved a path through the darkened road. "Just admit I was right," Lucas had said, flashing a sideways grin as he kept his eyes on the road. Emily crossed her arms over her chest. "Never." His grin widened. "Oh, come on. We both know that movie was way too long." She scoffed. It was not too long. It was artistic. It was exhausting. You just don't appreciate good storytelling. He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Fine. What about this? Mint chocolate chip ice cream is disgusting. Her head snapped toward him. What? No. That's objectively false. It tastes like toothpaste. It's refreshing. It's a crime against ice cream. She gasped in mock offense. You just have terrible taste. His laughter filled the car, rich and warm. I can't believe I'm dating someone who enjoys eating frozen toothpaste. She rolled her eyes, but her lips twitched in amusement. Lucas reached over and grabbed her hand, intertwining their fingers effortlessly. Final debate topic, he said, his voice softer now. Who's more stubborn, you or me? She glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. You already know the answer to that. I do, he agreed. But let's test it. How? He smirked. I'm not letting you sleep until you admit I was right. Her jaw dropped. You wouldn't. He grinned. Try me. And he didn't. For hours he kept her awake, telling her ridiculous stories, asking absurd questions, tickling her just enough to make her squirm, but not enough to let her rest. Lucas, please, she had groaned, burying her face in a pillow when they finally reached the lake house. Say it. No. He chuckled, pulling the blankets over them as she fought off exhaustion. You're impossible, she muttered. You love me anyway, he whispered, brushing his lips against her temple. She sighed, sinking into his warmth. Even with your terrible taste in ice cream. He grinned. Even then. Emily blinked, returning to the present. She had lost track of how long she had been staring at their entwined hands, willing his fingers to move, wishing she could feel the warmth of his palm against hers like she used to. But his skin was cold. The warmth was gone. Her chest ached, her ribs tightening around her lungs, but she forced herself to breathe. She wasn't ready to let go. She couldn't. Her fingers smoothed over the back of his hand, pressing against the faint blue veins beneath his pale skin. He had never let her go before, so why would he let go now? A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. I'm still here, she whispered, leaning down, pressing her forehead lightly against his hand. Even if he couldn't hear her, even if he couldn't feel her, she would not leave him. Not now. Not ever. Emily no longer knew what day it was. There had been a time when she followed a schedule. She used to wake up, get ready for work, make coffee, check her emails, and chat with colleagues about upcoming projects. But now none of that mattered. Her life had shrunk to the space of this hospital room. Her day began when she walked through the sterile white doors and sat beside his bed. It ended when exhaustion finally dragged her under, only for her to wake up a few hours later, still in the same chair, still holding his unmoving hand. Morning had arrived again, but it made no difference. The same walls, the same quiet hum of machines, the same scent of antiseptic hanging in the air, suffocating, lifeless. She had thought she would get used to it, but how could anyone get used to this? Emily let her gaze drift to Lucas, studying his face as she had done every day for the past several weeks. His expression remained unchanged, lips slightly parted in unconscious stillness. His features, once so full of life, seemed frozen in time. A faint shadow of stubble dusted his jaw. A small but cruel reminder that time was still moving forward, even if he wasn't. She reached out and traced her fingertips along the edge of his palm, a touch so light that it felt like a whisper against his skin. She still remembered what it was like to have these hands hold hers. They had been warm, strong. They had lifted her onto countertops when she couldn't reach something, had guided her through crowded streets, had pulled her close when the world felt overwhelming. Now they lay motionless beneath hers. She swallowed hard, forcing down the wave of emotion that threatened to break through. Outside the room, life continued. She heard the muffled voices of nurses moving through the hallway, the distant sound of a cart rolling across the polished floor. Somewhere a patient laughed. Someone was healing. Someone was going home today. But not them. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath. There was no point in wishing things were different. Wishing didn't change anything. But waiting might. She squeezed his hand gently, just as she had done every day, just as she would do every day after this. She had never been patient before. Lucas used to tease her for it. "You're always in a rush," he had told her once, shaking his head in amusement as she huffed impatiently at a long line at the coffee shop. "I just don't like wasting time," she had shot back. "But some things are worth waiting for," he had countered, nudging her playfully. "Like what?" she had challenged. He had smiled then, a slow, knowing kind of smile, and simply shrugged. "You'll see." She hadn't known then what he meant. But she knew now, as here she was waiting, and she would wait for as long as it took. Emily leaned forward slightly, resting her forehead against the edge of his bed, breathing in the cold scent of hospital linen. She wasn't naive. She knew what the doctors thought. They had stopped trying to tell her to go home weeks ago. They had stopped offering reassurances that he would wake up, that things would get better. Now they only gave her that look, the one filled with quiet sympathy, the one that said, "You need to start letting go." But they didn't know him. Lucas hated silence. He hated stillness. He could never sit still for long, could never handle a quiet room without filling it with music, with conversation, with life. He would never choose this, so he had to be fighting. Her fingers traced small circles against his skin. She didn't say anything, didn't tell him she was scared, that she wasn't sure how much longer she could do this. Instead, she just sat there, because if he was still here, somewhere, somehow, he deserved not to be alone. Emily sat beside his bed, unmoving. Her hand rested on top of his, fingers lightly tracing the familiar lines of his palm, following the delicate blue veins beneath his pale skin. She had memorized every detail, every ridge, every tiny scar. She had memorized him. And yet she was terrified of forgetting. The way he laughed, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, the warmth of his hands when he held her. These memories had once been so vivid, so real. But as the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, she felt them begin to slip, like water through her fingers. She squeezed his hand, as if holding on tighter might stop him from fading. Outside, the hospital was waking up. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Nurses whispered, monitors beeped softly. Life continued beyond these walls, but Emily remained trapped in the same unchanging moment, where hope and despair intertwined so tightly that she could no longer tell them apart. Her body ached from exhaustion, but she refused to leave. Because what if? What if today was the day he came back to her? What if she stepped away for just a moment, and he woke up alone? The thought sent a sharp pang through her chest, tightening her grip on his hand. She had never believed in miracles, but she believed in him. It had been late at night when Lucas once told her his biggest fear. They had been lying on the rooftop of his apartment. The city stretched out below them, glowing with 1,000 tiny lights. The sky above was vast, endless, a deep shade of indigo speckled with stars. "I'm not afraid of dying," he had said suddenly, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful. Emily turned her head to look at him, surprised. "Why would you even think about that?" He shrugged, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns against her wrist. "Because death isn't the worst thing that can happen to a person." She frowned, waiting for him to continue. Lucas sighed and tilted his head back, gazing at the stars. "You die twice," he murmured. "Once when your heart stops beating, and again when the last person who remembers you forgets." Emily didn't know what to say to that. So instead, she took his hand in hers, interlocking their fingers. "I'll never forget you," she whispered. His lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Then I guess I'll live forever." Emily exhaled shakily, blinking back the tears that blurred her vision. Her fingers tightened around his, and she lowered her head, pressing his hand against her forehead as if trying to anchor herself to something real, something solid. "I haven't forgotten," she murmured, her voice breaking. Tears slipped down her cheeks, warm against her cold skin. She had held herself together for so long. She had stayed strong, believing that if she just waited long enough, if she just loved him enough, he would find his way back to her. But today, for the first time, doubt crept in. What if she was wrong? What if he was already gone, and she was the only one who refused to see it? Her chest heaved with silent sobs, her whole body trembling from the effort of keeping herself together. "Please," she whispered into the quiet. "Come back to me." Nothing happened. No movement. No sound. Only the steady mechanical beeping of the monitors. Emily's breath hitched, and for the first time, she felt the weight of all these months pressed down on her, crushing her beneath their silence. She had waited. She had hoped. But hope, she was beginning to realize, was the cruelest thing of all. It kept her tethered to something that might never return. It whispered lies in her ear, telling her to hold on when maybe, just maybe, there was nothing left to hold on to. A cold shiver ran down her spine. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, what if this was all there would ever be? What if waiting wasn't enough? She closed her eyes, her tears soaking into the white hospital sheets beneath her hands. And for the first time, she let herself break. Emily sat motionless, her hands still gently cradling his. She no longer knew how many hours had passed since she had last moved. The exhaustion in her body had long faded into numbness, replaced by a weight that pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Something inside her had cracked. It wasn't a sharp, sudden break, but a slow and painful fracture. The kind that happened when something had been under pressure for too long. She had spent so many months holding herself together, clinging to hope, refusing to let go of the belief that he would return to her. But now, the silence felt heavier than before. It filled the space between them, stretched endlessly, suffocating her beneath the weight of her own thoughts. She forced herself to inhale, the air burning in her lungs. And then, because she didn't know what else to do, she began to speak. "You know," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "I always thought waiting was the hardest thing in the world." Her fingers traced slow, absent-minded circles over the back of his hand. "I never liked it. You used to make fun of me for that." A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips, though it never fully formed. "I remember how impatient I was when we planned our first trip together. I couldn't stand the waiting, the months of saving, the endless days of counting down. But you loved it. You said anticipation made things better." She swallowed, her throat tightening. "That's what you believed, right? That waiting for something made it more meaningful." Her gaze lingered on his face, searching for something, anything, that might tell her he was still here. A twitch of his lips, a flicker of his eyelashes. But there was nothing. Her voice grew softer. "You were always better at waiting than me. I don't know how to do this without you, Lucas." Her grip on his hand tightened, as if she could somehow pull him back from wherever he had gone. "I don't know how much longer I can keep believing in something I can't see." The words came out as a confession, fragile and broken. She had never allowed herself to say them before. She had spent months convincing herself that if she just held on, if she just loved him enough, he would wake up. But what if love wasn't enough? What if he was never coming back? A sharp pain twisted in her chest, and before she could stop herself, tears began to spill down her cheeks. She was tired. So tired. Her head bowed, her shoulders shaking as she let herself break in the silence. For the first time, she wasn't just crying for him. She was crying for herself. For all the days spent waiting. For all the nights spent whispering to him, filling the silence with words he never heard. For all the hope that had kept her breathing, even as it slowly suffocated her. And then, something changed. It was so slight, so delicate, that at first she thought she imagined it. A soft pressure against her fingers. So weak it could have been nothing. So faint it could have been a cruel trick of her exhausted mind. But it wasn't. Because a moment later, it happened again. A slow, hesitant squeeze. Emily's breath hitched, her body going completely still. The tears on her cheeks froze in place, forgotten. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Her mind screamed at her to be rational, to not get ahead of herself. But her heart knew the truth before her brain could process it. It was real. Her fingers trembled as she turned them over, pressing them firmly against his palm. The response was weak, so light that it could barely be called a movement. But it was there. She felt it. And it felt like the first breath of air after drowning. A sob escaped her lips, and she quickly covered her mouth with her free hand, afraid to move, afraid to lose this moment. Her head snapped up, her gaze locking onto his face. Nothing had changed, his eyes were still closed, his breathing steady and unchanged. But his hand had moved. That tiny motion shattered the endless, suffocating stillness that had surrounded them for so long. Her fingers curled around his, holding on to him as if he might slip away again. But he didn't. For the first time in all these months, he was fighting his way back to her. And Emily, her body shaking with relief, finally believed. Emily hadn't moved since it happened. She was still gripping his hand, her fingers gently curled around his, afraid that if she let go, even for a second, this fragile connection would disappear. Her breath was uneven, her body tense with anticipation, her heart pounding so violently that she could feel its rhythm in her fingertips. Lucas had moved. It had been small, weak, almost imperceptible, but she had felt it. And after months of nothing, of absolute stillness, of waiting and breaking and losing hope, even the smallest movement felt like the beginning of something impossible. She had spent so long drowning in silence that she had almost forgotten what it was like to believe. Her throat tightened, her lips trembled, but she refused to let herself cry. Not yet. She wanted to hold on to this moment, to keep it safe, to make sure it was real before she let herself feel everything that had been building inside her for so long. Her fingers brushed lightly over his knuckles. "I know you're there," she whispered. Nothing. No response. But she had felt it once, and that was enough. She exhaled shakily, closing her eyes for a moment, searching for the strength to keep waiting. Then, because the silence had become unbearable, she did the only thing she knew how to do. She spoke to him. "You always told me that dreams are what make life worth living," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Her fingers moved absently over his, tracing familiar lines, committing every detail to memory. "You said that without dreams, people just exist." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep speaking. "I remember the day you told me about your biggest dream." A small broken smile touched her lips. "I thought it would be something reckless, something impossible, something so you. But you just looked at me and said you wanted a house. A simple, quiet place where we could grow old together." Her voice shook slightly, but she kept going. They had been lying on his couch, her head resting on his chest, his fingers tracing slow, lazy circles on her back. The apartment had been dimly lit, the only sound the rain tapping gently against the window. Lucas had been staring at the ceiling, his voice distant, thoughtful. "I want a house with a porch," he had said suddenly. Emily had tilted her head to look at him, confused. "A porch?" He nodded. "A big one. The kind you can sit on in the evenings with a cup of coffee, just watching the world go by." She had smiled, the warmth in his voice wrapping around her like a blanket. "That's what you want most in the world? A porch?" He had chuckled, his fingers stilling on her back. "No. Not just a porch. I want a home." She had fallen silent, watching the way his expression softened as he spoke. "I want a place where I can wake up every morning knowing you're there," he had continued. "Where the kitchen always smells like coffee, where our dog, because yes, we're getting a dog, waits by the door for us to come home." Emily had laughed at that, shaking her head. "You've wanted a dog since you were a kid." "And I still do." She had rolled her eyes, but her heart had clenched painfully at the thought of it, of all of it. It wasn't just a house he wanted. It was a life. Their life. Together. Emily opened her eyes, blinking away the tears that threatened to spill. "You promised me that house," she whispered. Her voice was trembling now, thick with emotion. "You said we'd build it together. That we'd sit on the porch in the evenings, that we'd drink coffee in the mornings, that we'd have a dog waiting for us at the door." She let out a shaky breath, gripping his hand tighter. "I still believe in that future, Lucas." Her fingers trembled against his. "Do you?" And then, it happened. A soft, unmistakable twitch. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was barely there, so faint she almost doubted it, but she felt it. A small, weak pressure against her fingers. Not random. Not accidental. This time it was deliberate. A response. A sob escaped her lips before she could stop it. It was so small, so fragile, but it was real. She let out a shaky, disbelieving laugh, tears spilling freely now, staining the fabric of her sleeves. "Lucas," she choked out. Her free hand flew to cover her mouth, as if speaking too loudly might shatter this moment, might send him back into the darkness where he had been lost for so long. But he didn't let go. His fingers were still there, still curled around hers, still holding on. And for the first time in months, Emily allowed herself to believe in something bigger than waiting. She believed in him. She believed in them. And no matter how much longer it took, no matter how slow his return might be, she would wait. Because now she knew he was fighting his way back to her. Emily had not moved for a long time. She sat beside his bed, her fingers still wrapped around his, afraid to loosen her grip. The world outside continued without them. Voices echoed through the hospital corridors. The soft shuffle of footsteps moved past the door, but she no longer registered any of it. All that mattered was the fragile weight of his hand in hers, and the fact that, for the first time in months, he was holding her back. His touch was weak, barely there, but it was real. It was real. Her tears had not stopped, spilling silently down her cheeks as she stared at their entwined hands, as if afraid this moment would dissolve into nothing if she looked away. Her heart pounded violently, her chest tightening with an emotion too big for her body to contain. She had waited so long, through all the days that bled into each other, through every endless night filled with whispered pleas and aching silence. She had waited, and now finally he was here. Emily exhaled shakily, her breath catching in her throat. She squeezed his hand just slightly, and for a moment, she thought she felt him press back. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Her lips trembled as she leaned forward, resting her forehead lightly against their joined hands, closing her eyes as she tried to contain the overwhelming rush of emotion threatening to consume her. "You came back," she whispered, voice breaking. A part of her still couldn't believe it. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, had dreamed of it, begged for it, prayed for it. And now that it was happening, she felt as though she were suspended in some fragile dream, one that could shatter at the slightest movement. But this was real. He was real. And as if to remind her of that, something changed. A shift. A slow, hesitant movement. Emily's breath caught as her gaze snapped up to his face, watching with wide, desperate eyes. His eyelashes fluttered. Her heart stopped. Then his fingers twitched again, stronger this time. And then, after what felt like a lifetime, his eyes, those familiar, beloved eyes, opened. It was slow, the movement sluggish and heavy, as if the weight of months spent in darkness was still pressing down on him. His gaze was unfocused at first, his eyes flickering in confusion, lost somewhere between dreams and reality. But when he finally looked at her, something inside her broke apart and pieced itself back together all at once. His eyes, though dazed and exhausted, softened the moment they met hers. She let out a trembling sob, her hand covering her mouth as she tried to suppress the overwhelming wave of emotion crashing over her. He was here. He was seeing her. Her name came from his lips in a voice so faint, so hoarse, that she almost didn't hear it. But she did. And the sound of it shattered something inside her. A sob tore from her throat as she cupped his face, her fingertips brushing against the rough stubble on his cheeks. "Lucas," she choked out, barely able to breathe past the emotion clawing at her chest. His gaze softened, though his eyelids were already heavy again. His exhaustion was evident, his body still fragile, still weak. But he was awake. Emily let out a trembling laugh, pressing her forehead against his as she closed her eyes, unable to stop the tears from spilling down her face. She didn't need him to speak, didn't need him to explain what had happened, where he had been, how it had felt to be lost in the abyss of unconsciousness for so long. All that mattered was that he was here, that he had found his way back to her. She cradled his face gently, as if afraid he might disappear again, whispering words that had lived inside her for months, words she had spoken into the silence every night, hoping he could hear them. "I never left," she breathed, her lips brushing his temple. "I never will." His fingers, still weak, curled around hers once more. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt whole again. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so you don't miss more heartwarming stories.